Andrew, it's such a pleasure to have you today. But before we start and before we talk about science, I would like our listeners to know who they're listening to. So
Okay.
I know you grew up in Kenya and then you
Mhm.
trained in Yorkshire, which is very close to where I actually live as well.
Okay.
I know you spent some time teaching in Uganda, and then for the last 20 years or so, I believe you've been working in Liverpool, inventing
Mhm.
all sorts of different things to help reduce the numbers of mums suffering devastating consequences from giving birth. So, what I want to ask you as a starting point is what have you understood from all of this experience that you had over the last, well, over your career, I would say, from the best rooms, I suppose, in terms of resources across the world, really, to the least resourced ones?
Mm.
And where do you feel we still get things wrong?
Thank you very much, Emma, and thanks for the invitation to come along and speak. I think I had a very privileged background, actually, and I don't mean privileged in terms of wealth. My parents worked for the Methodist Church in Kenya, and so I grew up in a church compound in the middle of a very poor area in Mombasa. And spent my life playing football with the local boys. I wasn't really interested in education or learning. I just wanted to play football, and uh, and but what that's left me with, I think, throughout, even when we left Kenya when I was 15, it's left me throughout is a very acute understanding of what it's like to live in a poor area and really have very little financially, to have many of the systems blocking you, or you don't have access to them. And so all through my life, I guess I've had a very acute awareness of that. And so really, as I've progressed through my career, I've always tried to do maternity care, but with a focus on how you can help those who are disempowered, those who are at having the most difficult time. Um, there's a Gandhi quote which means a huge amount to me, which is it's something similar to if ever you've got a difficult decision to make, think about how it affects the very poorest in society, and then you find your indecision melting away. And that's absolutely true. If ever there's a difficult decision, you think, well, actually, the rich and the powerful will look after themselves. Actually, ha, how can I answer this question so it benefits those who are disempowered or don't have resources, and then actually many of the decisions become a lot easier. So
Yeah.
that's lived with me really all through my life. And when I came back to the UK, and then went to medical school in Sheffield, but even then, just after I'd got married and my wife and I went back to Uganda and spent 2 years there, that was all putting that into practice. And of course, I came then to Liverpool because Liverpool was very much central to that. Professor Nielsen, Jim Nielsen, had worked himself internationally in Zimbabwe, and had a close alliance with international health. The Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine is just down the road, so it was really a place where you could work on global health and work on developing care for the very poorest in society. And actually, the institution very much respects you, even though everyone else is slaving away here at the hospital, and I'm off in Uganda or in India, or they supported me through that, and I'll always be grateful to Liverpool for giving me those opportunities.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's such a powerful story. But I suppose, like you say, it's actually the experiences that you then bring back with yourself when you come back. But
Mm.
going back to that, almost from a more personal point of view as well, how did your family take that decision, to actually leave, let's say, a maybe somewhat comfortable consultant job to go and do these um sort of missions, if you like?
Well, And the truth is, I'm still in a comfortable consultant post, so don't tell anyone. But actually, I didn't sort of leave it. What the university has is a system whereby you can work 50% for the university and work 50% clinical. So I was doing more or clinical work here at Liverpool Women's Hospital, doing antenatal clinics, doing sessions on delivery suite, doing turning of babies, which is a particular thing that I've done all through my life. So doing all those sessions at the same time, I was doing those half the week, and then the other half of the week, I was able to do my international research. So actually, I it's been a great life actually. I shouldn't say that. I'm only 60, but it's I've been very privileged to be able to do all this work as a consultant at the same time as running programs in some of the poorer parts of the world, and really supporting systems there.
Absolutely, but at the same time, if that would be an opportunity for everyone, not everyone is willing to take. So, I suppose there was that spark that
It's
ultimately
worked very
motivated
well for
you.
me. I mean, I've loved it. It wouldn't be for everybody,
No,
but it's allowed me to get the best of both worlds for me. And it's not right for everybody.
no.
But for me, being able to go back to Africa regularly, which is sort of where my roots are, and it's funny because when I look at my parents' career, they spent 10, 11 years in Kenya. But actually, the rest of their careers were in the UK.
Hmm.
Whereas for me, being there from when I was 4 until I was 15, it's such a powerful time of your life,
Yes.
where you really those real formative years where the education, the experiences, and so they've had for my parents, it was only 11 years. But for me, actually, it's sort of been my life. It's guided and focused the whole of the rest of my life. Um, and that I will always be grateful to my parents for.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you say, it was those years where, you sort of discovered yourself and the world, isn't it? So I can see
Mm.
why you feel the passion and your heart being still there and supporting those countries as well.
Mm.
Um, okay, so thank you so much for this. One of the areas that I wanted to discuss with you as well, because we seem to focus a lot on birth preparation, and quite often we don't necessarily think so much about the immediate postpartum period, is those few minutes after the baby was born. So I would like you to tell us why do you feel it's so important to, first of all, obviously observe the mom very closely, but also in terms of what actually happens immediately after, just essentially explain and address that those immediate few minutes. Why is so important to the point that we actually define it as part of birth is third stage, isn't it, in medical terms?
Yeah.
What does that actually mean? What does it happen?
Well, it's a fascinating time of the birth. There's a lot going on, but it's very much focused on a time where actually it's the highest risk of all from the mother's point of view. And so you might think, well, the baby comes out and then the rest of it actually, well,
Yeah,
the action's all over,
yeah,
and you're looking after the baby and everyone's coming in, and it's a lovely time. But actually that first half an hour or so just after the birth is absolutely critical, and it's the highest risk time actually of a woman's life,
why?
because the greatest number of deaths in women worldwide during the reproductive period occur in those first few minutes just after birth, because of the risk of bleeding. And that was my particular interest. Um, there's a difficult condition called retained placenta,
Hmm.
whereby the baby comes out, and normally the baby's of course initially attached to the cord, and then you cut and clamp the cord, and then you wait for the placenta to come out, and usually it just comes and you don't think too much about it, and that's the end of it.
Yeah,
But there's a very difficult condition where the placenta doesn't come out, and it stays inside. And the danger then is that puts you at high risk of bleeding. And the only way of removing it is to put your hand inside, which obviously you need an anesthetic for, but to put your hand inside and scoop it out, which is it's not a high risk procedure, but it is associated with heavier bleeding that whole time. So you need to be very prepared for that. It's very uncomfortable if you don't have an anesthetic. Now, when I very first, this is going back to the late 90s, when I first was starting to work on global health, I was looking at this condition called retained placenta because I was acutely aware that it's got a very high death rate in low income settings. Because if you don't have access to a hospital, a place where you can have an anesthetic, a place where you can have a blood transfusion, then you're at high risk of bleeding. And people in studies in Nigeria from the 80s, where there was very little by way of healthcare, found that about a quarter of women with a retained placenta died. And that's because they bleed very heavily. And you can imagine if you're giving birth at home or in a rural centre, and you need to try and find a health centre which is functioning, where there's a theatre, where there's blood. Actually, when you've got a very disrupted and poorly functioning health system, that's a very dangerous time indeed. And so the very first research I did was to look to see whether you could take oxytocin, which you'll be well aware of, which we normally give just to help the womb contract. What could happen if you took a placenta which was still inside and the cord was still there, and you injected oxytocin into the cord so that it went up into the placenta, came across the back of the placenta,
Hmm.
contracted the womb down, and pushed the placenta out?
Hmm.
Suddenly, you'd have a technique which could treat this without having to go to theatre, without having to have doctors, anaesthetists to do that, and could be done by midwives in the community. So that
Hmm.
was the very first piece of research I did, trying to find disruptive processes in the system which were low cost, which were easy to do, which could suddenly shift high risk situations so that instead of having to go to hospitals which often don't have the facilities, you could do it in the community still.
Hmm.
And you could potentially save huge numbers of lives. Sadly,
Absolutely.
it didn't work. We did this big trial with the World Health Organization. It was called the Release Trial, and we had a comparison between oxytocin and other women. We gave just water, and we didn't know which was which. Some people had the water, some people had the oxytocin. A double-blind, randomized trial, and injected a large number of women. I'm trying to think how many it was now, 400 something women with that
Hmm.
when they had the retained placentas, and it made absolutely no difference. It was very
Wow.
disappointing
Wow.
because if it had worked, that would have solved a huge problem. But no, didn't work. And actually, that's been a lot of the studies I've done, sadly, are things which you think, right, this is going to be it. This is going to be the low cost innovation which will make high quality healthcare available to women in poorer situations, but also to women ourselves in the UK or in richer settings. And so you go searching for these sort of disruptive treatments or innovations. And
Absolutely.
I'll show you a couple of them in a minute that we're still working on. But they don't always work, unfortunately. And
Yeah.
the umbilical oxytocin, as it's called, was one of those which didn't work.
Yeah, but like you say, if we don't try, then we would never know. And it's just the idea behind it, isn't it? Which made sense. So I guess just to put things in perspective for who
Hmm.
is listening, can you tell us how often does this happen? Is there a difference in between more developed countries as opposed to least developed countries? And is there anything that women can do to prevent retained placenta?
There isn't, unfortunately. It occurs in about 1 in 20 births, so it's not that common, but it happens, and it's frustrating because at the end of a lovely birth, it's all gone
Yeah.
straightforwardly. You think all the difficulties past. The woman's happy, baby's out crying, breastfeeding, skin to skin, everything's good, and then suddenly, the placenta isn't coming,
Mm.
and that's a time where there's high risk of bleeding, and so then if you're in a home birth, then you need to come quickly into hospital at that stage, or if you're in hospital, you need to start getting theatres ready. Um, it's a I there's it's difficult because there's a whole number of complications that can occur at that time. So retained placenta is one of them, but also we've this is a time when even when the placenta comes out, if the womb doesn't contract well, then that's when you get this so-called postpartum hemorrhage,
Hmm.
which is actually what is the biggest killer of women worldwide.
Yeah.
But thankfully, I mean, we used to see, we're doing a project with some artwork at the moment with a thing called the blood clock. You can look it up online, but a friend of mine developed this thing called the blood clock, which is a remarkable. It's quite a it needs a trigger warning attached to it, really, but it's got some artificial blood in a tank, and it slowly drips down into a conical tube, which is pivots in the middle. And when the blood fills up, this artificial blood fills up to about 2.5 liters, this whole thing tilts and splashes all this artificial blood down,
Wow.
and then it slowly cranks back up again. And as it cranks back up, so it moves on the clock 6 minutes. And that's because a woman was dying from postpartum hemorrhage every 6 minutes around the world. Now that was 20 years ago. And what's remarkable was that the clock was built so every time it clicks back up, it moves the clock on by 6 minutes. And so
Hmm.
you've got a working clock which tells the time, but it does so in 6 minute increments. But what's remarkable is that since then, in the last 20 years, deaths from postpartum hemorrhage have reduced by about a half. So
Wow.
it's now only a woman who dies every 12 minutes,
Hmm.
which is still a horrible statistic. Goodness me, it's chilling to think that that's happening in a world where we've got such wealth and such riches. Um, Once every 12 minutes is horrendous, but actually in the last 20 minutes, 20 minutes, 20 years, it shows what can
Half.
happen
Yeah.
if the resources are put in place. Um, and I mean, of course, I'd like to think that I'm purely responsible for it, but there's so many different people working on improving health services worldwide, that you find all sorts of ways. There's been huge amount of money put in from the Gates Foundation, for example, into solving some of these problems. But actually, if you also look at health services, if India is the main place. And if you think about India 20 years ago, there were all sorts of problems. It was really quite a poor country. And now
Hmm.
you go to India, you go to Mumbai or to Delhi, and you see the skyscrapers, you see the health services, you see really a very well developed country. Now, that's not me due to me with my injections of oxytocin, or anything that we've invented to improve healthcare. Actually, it's all related to economic development of the country, so that now you can afford having an ambulance service, you can afford having
Yes.
good health care for the population, you can afford emergency care, good maternity care. That's what's made the difference in India. It's I know it pains me to say it, but it's not actually due to anything that we've invented.
Mm.
Even though I've committed my life to doing that, I think we've made changes and we've made things
Absolutely.
uh, better care cheaper, and we've learned how what does work and what doesn't work. And so it's not to belittle all the work that we've done. But actually, if you really want to improve maternal health, improve your economics, and improve the richness of your country, because then you can afford to put into place all the stuff that is already there. If you took the British maternity system and exported it the worldwide, you would get very few maternal deaths worldwide. Because there's still large numbers of women who die in pregnancy each year from completely preventable causes.
Absolutely.
And if every country was as rich as the UK, then the whole problem would be solved because you'd have good health services. That's what it needs. It doesn't
Absolutely.
necessarily need the research into new things. It needs putting in place what we've already got.
Yeah, consistently across. Yeah. So talk me through what it means in the UK, because obviously, maybe some women who are sitting and listening to this conversation now, they feel more frightened about a postpartum hemorrhage than they were when we started. So what do we actually, I hope not, but let's try to reassure them. What do we actually do in the UK to try to prevent this from happening? And then if you wouldn't mind telling me about some of your research into the field as well. I know you've invented some fancy stuff.
Well, it's not fancy stuff. It's all made to be low cost stuff. So it's very unfancy, actually, and that's deliberately unfancy because it's what could be afforded in low income settings.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, no, I mean, postpartum bleeding after childbirth happens the world over.
Yeah.
The difference is if you can get high quality, good care as soon as it starts happening.
Hmm.
The rate at which women bleed after childbirth is going up. And you might think, oh my goodness, this is disaster, this is awful. But although it's going up, as soon as it starts happening, we've got the resources in place in the UK to instantly put a stop to it.
Hmm.
And that almost always happens. We've got the medication available, we've got fridges. Fridges? Why are you interested in a fridge? We've got a fridge which
Yes.
can keep the medication at the right temperature so that it's effective, which may seem a stupid thing, but actually, if you don't have that in rural settings, Africa, then of course the drugs are completely ineffective.
Yeah.
So you need not only the medication, you need to be able to keep them at the right temperature. You need to have a midwife or a doctor there who can rapidly get to help you in order to administer those medications, those treatments. Some people need a blood transfusion, but then you need to make sure it's safe. And you can imagine trying to get a safe blood transfusion in a country where there's high rates of HIV is
Yeah.
incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
And of course, you need good electricity supplies to keep all the blood cold. You need it's a logistic nightmare to try and get blood services
Yeah.
in place. But here I come to the UK, and it was a wonderful shock, but quite a distressing shock when I came back from Uganda, having worked clinically there for 2 years, to come back and just see the amount of resources. And sometimes I just wanted to weep because it's where you've worked in a system where there isn't anything, and you've got women dying in front of you when you know it's easily solvable. To come into a situation where you just put your hand out and there's boxes of gloves. Who knows how the gloves got there? I didn't put them there. And but somehow magically the system works so that not only are the drugs paid for, but they're supplied, they're restocked on the shelves, so that if I go into a room and just go, oh, where's the gloves? I can just put my hand out and they're there. And you
Yeah.
just think, wow, it's we take it all for granted, but when
Absolutely.
you see what happens if bills aren't paid, or if equipment is taken from the supplies room, or if the accountant hasn't turned up for work and therefore the bill isn't paid. These are all critical people in the system, and it's only when you've seen what happens if just one of those cogs. I know it doesn't feel like a beautifully working Swiss watch sometimes in the NHS, but actually you need all those different cogs working. That's a manual watch, isn't it? Not electronic. But maybe it's the same with electronics, but you need all those different cogs working. And if just one of those cogs isn't working, the accountant's off sick and HR hasn't arranged anyone to cover them. What do? Well, the bills don't get paid, and one thing leads to another, and suddenly I go, quick, get me a pair of gloves, and they're not there. Um, so you realize immediately how well off we are. But also it gives a slightly strange attitude, and I guess maybe people have seen this in my writings, is that um, when you look at the difficulty, I mean, people talk that we're going through a difficult time in maternity in the UK at the moment, but a lot of the aim over the last 20 years has been to improve outcomes for babies, for newborns, and to reduce the number of stillbirths, reduce the number of babies who die immediately after birth, and it's the lowest rate that it's ever been, ever, in the UK, and it's continuing to get better.
Yeah.
The graph slowly came down, and it continues to come down. It had a bit of a blip for COVID, but continues to come down. And I spend quite a lot of time reassuring women who come to our hospital, because they go, "Oh, we hear it's a nightmare in here, and that it's dangerous, and I'm really worried about it, and I think maybe I'm safer off going and giving birth on my own, or
Yeah.
free birthing."
Yeah.
And people don't realize that actually it's the safest ever time
Yeah.
to give birth from the baby's point of view. Now, some would argue that in terms of trying to secure safety for the babies, and you'll have heard about the tragic stories of
Of
women who have
course.
come forward because their baby has either been stillborn or they had a bad outcome at the birth, and they're awful for everybody to hear. They're really tragic. Question is, how do you prevent that? I mean, it's far less likely to happen than any other time in history in the UK. We're not as good as some European countries, but it's the best time ever in the UK to give birth if you're a baby. But in order to achieve that, to try and catch those occasional bad outcomes, what we're doing now is doing more and more intervention to try and catch that occasional baby. And women are increasingly saying, "I've heard that occasionally babies are stillborn." And you go, "Well, yes, that's true. And occasionally there's bad outcomes. I read about it and I know about it. I think I could, I think I should do a cesarean section. It's too unsafe to have a normal birth." And you can sort of understand it, because there's this sort of spirit of fear from all the stories that you hear. Now, I think there's far less of those stories than there would have been 20 years ago, but people didn't talk about them. There was a sort of a conspiracy of silence around maternity, and it was somehow the woman's lot. That you had a difficult time in maternity, and women would group together, and it was somehow
Yeah.
a bond between women, that they'd had
Yeah.
that difficult experience, but it wasn't really talked about widely. Um, but now it is talked about widely, and it's not that it's a new thing, it's that now we're hearing about it in a way that we didn't do in the past. And that's understandably making people very, very frightened of labour, when
Absolutely.
actually it is the safest time ever to give birth.
Yeah.
But we're doing more and more intervention now, and when you intervene, when you do cesarean sections, and people want cesarean sections when there's no underlying problem with the pregnancy, and we do those for if people want those and they understand the risks of them. But of course, you're more likely to bleed if you do a cesarean section than you have a normal birth. You're less likely to get there's a type of brain damage which you can get where you get loss of oxygen to the brain, which thankfully is pretty rare, but you're less likely to get that because you're not going through
As
the
a baby.
labor.
As a
um,
baby.
for the baby, that
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
And of course, you're less likely to get tears down below, vaginal tears, and less likely to get forceps, but you're more likely to have a bigger bleed. And of course, if you have a delivery by cesarean section this time, then a second pregnancy then becomes far higher risk.
Yeah.
If you'd had a normal birth the first time, the risks go down and down. If you've had a cesarean section the first time, then the risks go up and up. Now that plays into the whole equation, because of course you've then got women having far less births. So if you're only going to have one birth ever, then actually it's a reasonable balance. You say, well, what will I take? Will I remove that very rare risk of a baby having a bad outcome by doing a cesarean section, but accepting that it'll give me other risks, which
Yeah.
are largely maternal risks rather than babies' risks. And actually, most mothers would take their own risk above a baby's risk, actually. And so, with the change in culture, with women becoming increasingly empowered, people are saying, well, actually, even though it might harm me, I'm prepared
Mhm.
to go through that. Um, but the second birth suddenly becomes a lot more complicated. And
Yeah.
then you're putting in the second birth a whole load of complications which you wouldn't have had. So the womb can open up, the old scar can open up. Some,
What
of
does
course,
that mean for a mom? How would that impact mom or baby?
so it tends to happen during labor,
Okay.
when you're in good going labor, and you start to get increasing discomfort along the scar, and you sometimes get some bleeding, you get some heart trace abnormality, which is why we routinely watch the heart tracing in women who've had previous cesarean
So that
sections.
would be babies, right?
That would be the baby's
Yeah.
heart rate, yes. But uh, in the worst situations, the womb pops open, and then suddenly the baby is released from the womb, but still inside your tummy, which
Yeah.
is a slightly strange thing. But then the womb contracts, and the baby runs out of oxygen. Then, so that's
How
a big
quickly would
emergency.
would you have to act in that situation for mom and baby to be safe? And how often does it actually happen? Again, not wanting to alarm anyone.
No, I mean, in women who've had a previous cesarean section, the rate of the scar opening up is about 1 in 200 in a birth, if you're going through labour. So 199 women out of 200 won't have it at all. So
Yeah.
it's not the most likely thing to happen. And when we do see any signs of it, we jump in fairly quickly to do a cesarean section.
Hmm.
Um, the actual opening up where the womb where you're contracting and the womb initially opens up, which is the 1 in 200, but then actually pops, as it were, and the membranes pop and the baby's released into the cavity, then is really very rare. It's a small proportion of those, but those are the ones with much worse outcome. Now, if that happens in hospital, then you can get straight into theatre. We've normally prevented that, and
Yeah.
with our move towards cesarean section, we're preventing more and more of those. And if you do get a baby who's actually floating around within your tummy but outside the womb, then the majority of them we can get to in time, so as to mean that the baby isn't damaged by that.
Hmm.
But it's a very catastrophic thing, and can lead to a hysterectomy, can lead to even baby deaths.
Hmm.
Um, so it's a the trouble is, but whenever you talk about these things, they're sort of downstream from the initial event.
Of
They
course.
only occur in people who've had previous cesarean sections, and thankfully we can normally manage them, we can normally prevent them, and normally stop them happening. But that's exactly the same with brain injury in a first pregnancy, which
Yeah.
is what we're doing a cesarean section to prevent.
Yeah.
So you prevent one very rare bad outcome, but actually by preventing that very rare bad outcome, you can put yourself at risk of a completely new rare bad outcome,
Mm.
which you weren't sort of prepared for. So it's not an easy equation, and I guess what used to happen was that we used to have quite a paternalistic system whereby, look, I'm the doctor, you're the pregnant woman. I'll tell you what to do. I'll advise you what to do, and actually, you should probably do it,
Do it.
because I'm the expert, you're not. And there
Many
was a sort
women from
of
many other cultures still
what you're
expect
told
this.
type
Yes. Yes.
process, which on the whole worked, because we were trying to do our best. I spent my life writing guidelines to try and get the absolute correct treatment. And of course, it's a relatively low cost way of doing it as well, because if I don't know, if suddenly come in and you start to go into labor at only 32 weeks and your membranes break, well, okay, we know exactly what to do. We've got detailed guidelines for that. We put you on a particular sort of conveyor belt,
Pathway. Yeah.
and we try and get the care exactly right for that.
Yeah.
Now, if you then say, well, actually, I don't want that type of care. I don't want antibiotics in that situation, or I don't want to have a particular care, or I want to go home instead. Well, that's okay, but that's quite complicated then to deal with because we're dealing not with somebody on a conveyor belt of care,
Yeah.
which is relatively low cost, but we're dealing with a whole multitude of different care that you can give. And of course, it's a woman's right to choose what should happen to her in pregnancy. It's her
Of
body.
course.
And even if we think that it's not the best idea from the baby's point of view, or it will put the baby at risk, ultimately the baby is part of the mother, and it's well borne out legally, ethically, that actually it's a woman's right to decide
Yeah.
what happens
Yeah.
until the baby is born. And so um, it's
How
become
do
a
we
quite a
convey that
complicated
message
system.
though? Because as you say, it's such a fine balance between, acting and recommending things in line with best evidence possible, and yet respecting someone's choice. Because you mentioned something around the cesarean section and
Mm.
the risk potentially being higher for the mother in a first time section as opposed to the baby. But I believe there are some potential risks for the newborn as well if they're born via cesarean section. And I don't know to what extent they get discussed and ultimately how that decision gets made. So I suppose what would be the best question to ask from a woman's point of view to make the best decision that is right for her, but also in line with best evidence? Because I feel, particularly looking at some of the bad incidents that have happened, things that were said in the media, it's always a little bit that conversation around, well, was she really informed about the risks that she was going against? And should we call it against medical advice? Should we call it a deviation from clinical guidelines? Which in many ways just feels like we're changing the label, but ultimately the idea remains the same, isn't it? So what should that conversation be for that mother to truly understand what that decision means?
Well, I think ultimately, as obstetricians or as midwives, we increasingly need to act as if we were lawyers. If you go and see a lawyer, you go to a lawyer for advice. You're not going to a lawyer for them to tell you what to do and you have to do it and that's your,
No.
uh, do what I say or get out. I'm not, well, you go to a lawyer, you get advice, and you either accept their advice or you don't
Sure.
accept their advice, and that's your prerogative. And there's nothing demeaning to the lawyer about that. They give you their expert advice and they accept that
Yeah.
some people won't want it. And I think that, that's the model we should have. But it's a very difficult problem, I think, which we haven't fully resolved, is how to get the balance right between advising people and not coercing.
Yes.
And that's a little bit strange because if you say, well, I would advise you to have I don't know, postpartum hemorrhage, of course, is my particular interest. So let me take an example from that. Um, we routinely in the UK give an injection, usually into your thigh, immediately after the birth, which helps the womb contracts and reduces the rate of postpartum hemorrhage.
Hmm.
Now, it's a drug. It's completely up to the woman whether she has it. It nearly halves the rate of bleeding of heavy bleeding after childbirth. It has very few side effects, and so it seems like an obvious thing to do. And all guidelines around the world recommend it. Does a woman have to do that? No, she doesn't.
No.
But if I go to a woman and say, we routinely give oxytocin as an injection after birth, and she says, "Oh, I don't want it, thanks." And if I go, "Well, you could die, if you don't have that." Well, that's coercion, really, isn't it?
Yes.
Whereas
Absolutely
if
changes the conversation, doesn't it?
that's different, isn't it? And yet there's been people criticized who, when people have ended up not being cared for in the correct way for postpartum hemorrhage because they had extra bleeding to start with, and they say, well, I was never warned. You remember the tragic case in Rochdale, I think it was, where a woman died.
Yes.
Actually, we didn't understand that she could have died. Well, That's very difficult because if you say, well, do as I tell, otherwise you may die, well, that's coercion, and yet you somehow need to also convey that. So
Yeah,
it's a very complicated uh, discussion that you need to have. And I think it's what we really need to do is completely reimagine and reconstruct antenatal education in this country.
I
It's
agree.
been seen as a little bit of a sort of a it's not terribly interesting. It doesn't really matter. Well, the people who want to go to the National Childbirth Trust, and it's done a little bit in the hospitals, but we don't spend a huge amount of money on it. But I think actually that's going to be critical moving forward because it's really important that women understand what are the risks, what are the benefits of different pathways, so they can make that right decision. It's also important in consent because in consent you need to know exactly what's happening to you because you don't want to be suddenly caught by surprise in late labor saying, "Oh, it looks as if your baby's in trouble. We're going to need to use forceps," and you think, "Well, I,
Why
I
is
I don't
that?
really have time to think about it." And they
Yeah,
say, "Well, yeah, yeah, you need to make a decision now. Your baby's heart rate's, that's not proper consent, is
yeah,
it?" So
absolutely.
that all needs to have been discussed antenatally.
Yeah.
So at the point at which you say your baby's heart rate's starting to go down, and you in labour say, "Oh, do you think you're going to have to use forceps? I hope not." You go, "Well, I'm hoping not, but let's see if we can manage." I'm sorry, it
Mm.
looks as if we need to use forceps. Is that okay? Yes, that's okay. And that feels a respectful way to have
Got
understood
her
the
in a
consent
yeah,
and
absolutely.
have a really good working relationship. It's not to have been silent the whole way through labor and go, "Oh, we shouldn't tell people about forceps because it probably won't happen and it's quite
Yeah,
nasty when it does." So no, you need to have discussed that all the way through
yeah.
so that when it does happen, then actually then people understand what's happening and can give true consent as to whether it's what they want or not.
Absolutely, yeah. And to your point around antenatal education, I think it seems to be too generic. Women do not understand what actually applies to them, what doesn't, and how they can actually make decisions regarding their own care. But yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking about something. So I trained in Italy. I'm not sure if it's the same thing now, but I finished my training about 18 years ago now. And actually, you couldn't get an epidural without a consent being signed before labor. So the whole point about this was that you would have an antenatal appointment with the anesthetist, and they would teach you exactly what it meant, what the needle looked like, what were the risk factors associated with that, what it actually meant in practical terms. They will give you the consent, you take it home. And as long as you were signed before you started labor, then that applied because otherwise
How
the
interesting.
argument was that if you were in lots of pain and I would say, well, I have this magic thing to give you that could take that
Mm,
pain away,
mm,
you would
mm,
sign it, but it wouldn't be a true
mm.
consent. So,
I, it's fair enough. It's not an unreasonable
no,
argument.
yeah,
My
yeah,
only question would be, well, what happens if you get somebody who hasn't come to that 36-week appointment,
they couldn't get
and
it. They literally
if
couldn't
they
get it.
just then
It was
to
a bit cruel.
deny,
Yeah,
then that's a different type of
yeah,
cruelty, isn't it?
yeah,
It's a different type of problem
yeah,
whereby coercion clearly you shouldn't do, and clearly you should have consent because those are bad things to do something without consent. But equally, it's a bad thing to deny somebody something of great comfort to them when
exactly.
they are requesting it.
It,
So
it, it was, it
it's
was,
just,
it
hmm,
was pretty black
I
on
can't believe that's happening still now, is it?
possibly not. I
Or
don't
maybe
know.
people
I
will
don't
write
know.
in and say, "Yes, I live in Italy, and I'm it's still a problem." But
I have many colleagues. I should probably ask. I
you
still have many
find out
colleagues that
for
are
me.
working. Yeah, I will. Yeah, I'll have to message you. But yeah, I mean, in many ways, I understand. Obviously, women were told throughout pregnancy, if this is something that you're considering, then go and do your consent because you can decide not to have it. But if you don't have a consent, it's not going to be an option. So, and obviously it was free and they could have that discussion throughout at some point during the pregnancy was easily
Mm.
accessible in that sense. But yeah, I suppose I can understand that side of things as well, although it seems a bit extreme, definitely. But yeah, no, this was really interesting. I was wondering because we talked a lot about postpartum hemorrhage, and I was wondering if you would be able to show us the butterfly.
Okay, well, strangely, this is something which came up. I'd always been interested in postpartum hemorrhages, bleeding after child, and especially ways in which you can treat it without using complicated systems or drugs. And it was actually only when my wife had a postpartum hemorrhage, which is
Oh,
rather odd. Yeah, that. It seemed to be it was actually she'd had births before, so but suddenly she was in the middle of having a pool birth, was pushing and pushing, and this little one just wouldn't come out.
hmm.
And myself and the midwife were sort of looking at each other, thinking, well, it's half an
Been a
hour now.
while.
Usually you don't push this long. And then she kept pushing, and it was three-quarters of an hour, and both me and the midwife were thinking, "Oh dear, this isn't looking hopeful." And it got to an hour, and said to my wife, this should have come out by now. We really should be. I think we need to find out what's going on. I'm almost certainly the head's in a funny position,
Mm.
and she then gave an almighty push. She said, "Oh, give me a couple. I'm gonna get it." And suddenly, she describes how she felt something suddenly give inside, and the little one came out, and she started bleeding. Now, when I tell you the story like that, you'll go, I bet that baby has suddenly twisted and it's caused a tear higher up in the vagina, which is why she's bleeding from. And,
Hmm.
and it sort of sounds easy, but actually, when people start bleeding, what we do is immediately give drugs
Yes,
because the vast majority of bleeding comes from a womb which isn't contracting.
contracting.
Um, uh, but it got me thinking in the days after. So what's going on here? Why do we why do we not diagnose it correctly? And so started to think I should have been there with my wife, but yeah, my mind was whirring around. I was there with my wife, but my mind was also whirring, thinking how can we work out where the blood's coming from? And actually, if you had something like a small cone or something that you put just under the womb itself, then you could see what blood was coming from the womb and what blood was coming from the outside.
Hmm.
Um, but actually, that thinking evolved, and we got funding from the government eventually, and we've now done a whole number of studies on it, but we've come up with this thing called the butterfly device, which is all a little bit odd, I appreciate. But the idea being that there's a very effective treatment for a womb which isn't contracting. You can give drugs and such like,
Hmm.
but there's a very effective treatment which is just to squeeze the womb,
Hmm.
and that works beautifully. And indeed, if you cut yourself, if I was slicing onions tonight and I cut my finger, I wouldn't go, oh, it's bleeding, it's bleeding. What am I going to do? Let me go to hospital and take drugs. You wouldn't. You just squeeze
Apply
it
some
and it
pressure.
stops,
Yeah,
doesn't it?
yeah,
Pressure
yeah,
pressure works, and
yeah.
pressure works on a womb as well. The trouble is the womb's tucked right down inside. The only way to get to it is to put your hand inside the vagina, turn it into a fist, and compress the womb like that, which is
Yeah.
the stuff of
That's
nightmares, isn't
yeah.
it? But the thing is that we still do it. It's called bimanual compression, and if a woman is bleeding really heavily, then you may have no option but to say, "I'm sorry, I'm going to have to. This is the only way of doing it." Now, it's traumatic for the woman, and actually, it's difficult for the doctors as well. It's not an easy technique. You're squeezing like that, and your muscles of your shoulder start to hurt. It's awkward to do. My wife doesn't have any sympathy with me when I say this. She says, "Oh, great! So you're feeling sorry for yourself, are you? You're not the one with somebody's fist stuck up inside." But the question was, could you do that in a better way, get the same benefits from it without the trauma of it? And so that's what the butterfly does. And what it does is it folds initially like that with these two handles coming together. And so you've got a fairly narrow area there, which can then slide up inside the vagina. Once it's up inside, you can bring the two handles together and you can see how it forms a platform there, which sits immediately under the womb, and you can compress the womb against it. So,
which is
and
considerably smaller than, the length.
considerably smaller. Interestingly, when we did the studies on it, there were some women who'd had, first of all, this bimanual compression and then had this. And they said not only was it less painful, which of course you would expect,
Yeah.
but actually the difference between having somebody standing over you like this, gritting their teeth and sweat pouring off their brow, to somebody standing up a little bit, because what you're doing actually is just leaning down on
Hmm.
the womb. Once this is in place, you just lean down and compress the womb.
Hmm.
Um, so there seem to be all sorts of benefits. So the initial studies we did at the Liverpool Women's Hospital was then in just before COVID. And 57 women who were actively bleeding with postpartum hemorrhage. We used it, and it worked really very well. We were delighted. The women were very pleased with the way it worked. And the idea is that not only does it sort of turns off the tap, a bit like pressing your
Hmm.
finger
Hmm.
against a cut, it turns off the tap, which even if you need to go to theatre in the end, because
Yeah.
it's complicated, well, at least you turned
Slows
off the
down.
tap in the
Yeah.
meantime.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
the other thing it does is that if you're compressing the womb and the bleeding is still continuing, well, like my wife, you would know that actually it's not coming from the womb at all. It's
Hmm.
coming from a tear somewhere, in which case you can go straight to theatre to go and repair the tear rather than fiddling around with repeated drugs while the bleeding continues.
Yeah.
So the aim is that it's got a diagnosis of where the bleeding is coming from, but also an immediate treatment for those which are atonic, which is about 9 out of 10 of them.
Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah.
we've just got funding from the government to run a big study of this all around the UK, and 8 different hospitals with women who are actively bleeding to either have it treated initially with the butterfly or to have care as normal
Hmm.
to see whether it really does do what we hope.
Amazing. It sounds much better than the study with water versus oxytocin and in the placenta. Um,
They're all
so,
different ways of trying to make things simpler, try and provide high quality care not only at a low cost, because that's critical globally, but also something which is very acceptable from a woman's point of view.
absolutely. Absolutely. So, from your point of view, obviously it's hard to know, but how quickly do you think this potentially could be distributed to a majority of hospitals and maybe even internationally?
So we need to do the study first of all. There's been many treatments which have come out before for postpartum hemorrhage, and they've been released without proper testing,
Hmm.
and they've been tested from a safety point of view, but not without proper testing to make sure how effective they are,
Yeah.
and have been used widely and ended up, we find 20 years later that actually they're not as effective as we thought they were, and that women were stopping bleeding anyway. You're
Mm.
just using the drug and they stopped bleeding, and everyone went, "Oh, thank God, well, what a hero I am! I found the right drug. Aren't I the bee's knees?" When actually the bleeding was stopping anyway.
Mm.
So we need to make sure that it actually does improve care rather than it's just something you use and the bleeding's starting to stop.
Yeah.
Because the majority of people who bleed after childbirth, the bleeding does stop on its own.
Yeah.
We use all sorts of techniques to make it stop more quickly, and we have backup with blood transfusions and such like if we need it. But the majority of times, it does just stop on its own. That's what the body does. It's very effective at clotting and stopping bleeding. And so we normally just accelerate that process. But we need to make sure this really, by doing a randomized trial, really make sure that it's properly effective. And it really does help women rather than just jumping in on the act when everything's improving already. So
Absolutely.
the study's over 3 years. We've only just started just now, and so what are we? 2026. If it really is effective, then we're looking at it being available at the end of the century, I guess, about 2029, 2030.
Yeah. No, sounds really positive. Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to ask you something that I often get asked as well. Tell us a little bit more about the late core clamping. Obviously, we talked about prevention of postpartum hemorrhage,
Mm.
and we often well, many women would be recommended to have the injection, which is called symptometrin, with to help with the placenta being delivered and prevent hemorrhage, which we discussed already. Lots of women are then worried of two things, I suppose. Is the baby still receiving the cord blood if we do the injection? And then second thing, what is the late core clamping? How long does that need to be? Is it a couple of minutes? Is it 10 minutes? Is it until the cord gets white? I know you have a phrase about this as well. So yeah, I just wanted to ask your opinion on this because I can't think of anyone better who can explain it.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, it's a topic close to my heart. It's interesting. I'd been interested in these retained placentas, and so we'd been injecting oxytocin and all sorts into the cord
Yeah.
once it had already been clamped. We've been using the cord, and I've been interested in postpartum hemorrhage. But it actually wasn't until 2007, which was, I guess, 10 years into my sort of interest already, that my attention turned to actually what happens and when should you cut and clamp the cord.
Mm,
We used to think, I guess, that it was just a piece of string, really. It was just an inactive thing which connected the placenta to the baby. And once the baby's out, well, it's far more convenient if you just cut the string
yeah.
and give then you can deal with the two independently. What we didn't realize is that if you've got a baby and the placenta, then of the totality, it's about 400 mils. So it's nearly half a liter of blood, which the two of them have got between them. About a third of it is in the placenta.
A
While I
third of, I was about to ask you, how much blood does a baby have?
So it's about 400 mils in total
Wow.
between the baby and the placenta. Now,
Okay.
about a third of that is in the placenta, and two-thirds of it in the baby.
Wow. Hmm.
Now, what happens once a baby comes out is the natural thing is that the womb contracts, and as the baby starts to take its initial breaths, a lot of blood is drawn up into the lungs, and
Hmm.
it sucks across the majority of that blood into the baby. Now, there's a difficulty is that if as used to be the practice, as soon as the babies come out, you bang put on a clamp immediately onto the cord, then what you trap a whole load of blood with, well, there's a number of things that happen. You trap a whole load of blood within the placenta, but at the same time, the baby is takes those breaths, and suddenly the heart doesn't have any blood coming back to it because
Hmm.
actually the circulation of a baby comes from the baby's heart, it comes through to the placenta, and then back to the heart again. That's the majority of the blood takes that. That's the main highway through the baby and the placenta. And if you suddenly chop it off, then suddenly that a whole load of blood which should be coming back to the baby's heart isn't.
Yeah.
And then you find that the baby's heart rate more frequently drops in those few seconds immediately after the cord clamping. The baby often shuts down. Um, and so
And what
it was,
about stem cells? Sorry, because sorry to
yeah.
interrupt there, but again, lots of people they seem to think that there is a higher number of stem cells within the cord and the placenta as opposed to what the baby already has. Is that true?
Well, I don't think so. I think what you're getting is huge numbers of stem cells which are circulated. And
Hmm.
remember, it's not a circulation in the baby and a circulation in the placenta. It's all as one. So this blood is just flowing from the placenta to the baby, placenta to the baby,
Yeah.
placenta to the baby, and it's full of stem cells. It's and iron actually is some of the critical stuff which is there as well. Now, if you take the baby and you leave you clamp the cord immediately and leave a third of its total blood volume in the placenta, yes, it contains stem cells, which should be with the baby. It contains iron, which should be with the
Yeah.
baby. Um, but it's not suddenly that the baby has got reduced stem cells. It just doesn't have the benefit of those extra
All
ones
of
which
them.
are flowing around in the blood. You've left them in the placenta.
Thank you for explaining it that way. Yeah.
You throw it out. You throw it in the bin. All this
Yes.
precious blood, it just goes in the bin.
Hmm.
So it's critical that the baby gets this blood across to it. Um, and yeah, it's if you there was a study where in Swedish babies, they took babies, they immediately cord clamped, or they waited for 3 minutes, and they were healthy term babies, no other difference, and they just followed them up. And you could see when the baby was first born, those who had the delayed cord clamping, they'd got this 30%, this 33% of the blood across. So they had higher blood levels, of course. They had iron levels. Why is iron important? Because it's critical for brain development. And so there was this, would it make a difference that this baby has got more blood, more iron in it than this one does? And actually, as the baby's breastfed or it feeds, actually the iron levels uh, even out.
Mm.
But when they followed them up to 4 years old, 4 years later, they could see better social and motor development in the babies who'd had that early higher levels of iron. So the
Wow.
delayed cord clamping even had an effect at 4 years old. It's remarkable. And I talk about low cost interventions. Well, blimey, this is the lowest cost of all. It's actually taking away something harmful that we'd been doing for many years without realizing it. Um, so we've been working on how one of the critical times is if a baby comes out and isn't breathing. Okay, well that's a bit more tricky because if you've got a very premature baby and they come out, then you want to delay cord clamping because you know that you want that blood to get across. But at the same time, you also want to
Help.
transfer the baby to the neonatal care for them to
Absolutely.
look after. So how do you get that balance right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
you want the delayed cord clamping and you want the baby to be looked after by the best possible care.
Yeah.
And really, this wasn't resolved until there was a group of us who worked on it going back 15 years ago and built a thing called the LifeStart trolley, which was just like if you have breakfast in a hospital, traditionally you have one of those tables which come
Oh,
over. It's sort
yes.
of scoop
Yes.
shaped
Yes. Yes.
with wheels underneath. It was one of those which we found and we cut up and we sort of rebuilt it. And there was a very clever engineer over at the Royal called Peter Watt, who I worked with, and he cut it up and got a saw out and rebuilt it. And then
I
we
love
looked
that.
at, well, could you use that actually for getting resuscitation area right alongside the mother just when she's given birth? And of course you can. And what that allows you to do then, if a baby needs care immediately after the birth, is for the person who can give the care to be there
Hmm.
and to keep the baby with its cord so it gets the best of both worlds. It gets that blood infusion, it gets its rightful blood, and it gets the care that it needs.
Would they
So,
have space?
um,
Would they have space for it? How big is it?
yeah, yeah. No, it's very similar size actually to the bedside to an overbed table. Surprisingly enough.
And what are the pediatricians
Um,
saying?
Yeah, no, the pediatricians like it. One of the things we were worried about was that the mothers wouldn't like it,
Hmm.
because you think, well, if my baby does need a sort of a bag and mask, those
Yeah.
things to help with the breathing, what would a mother think? And there was a temptation to say, well, the mothers wouldn't like it. We'll take the baby away and we'll sort of hide behind and we'll do it secretly so they don't get distressed. Actually, when you ask the women, they got far more distressed by seeing their precious newborn transported away, or even in some places to a different room,
Hmm.
and something happening to the baby, which they don't know about.
Yeah.
That's far more distressing than actually having the baby right alongside them, still attached by the cord. And there's some beautiful videos when we very first used it of the baby being resuscitated, but then a woman reaching out and holding its hand or rubbing its
Mm.
foot as it's going through this resuscitation process. And of course, women don't wouldn't, no, nobody would want to see your baby resuscitated,
Of course.
but actually you want to see it getting the best care that it can get. And if that
Yeah.
requires it having a bit of oxygen and a bag and mask, well, okay, it's very rare that a newborn baby needs actually, the tube down the
Intubate.
throat and ventilating. That's very unusual. So the vast majority of babies just need the bag and mask. And actually, seeing that and seeing that the baby's happy and that it's intermittently breathing and is okay, and that it's starting to take little cries and such, that's far preferred to be there than they would that the baby is removed. So it was
Absolutely.
very reassuring when we did the studies to ask women about it, and they were happy with it.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point actually, because we just assume what they would like and not like. And quite
We've been
often when we
very
ask the,
guilty of that in the past, I'm afraid, and
yeah,
and you just think, well, why didn't you ask?
yeah,
Why?
exactly.
And we didn't, and I don't quite know why. I think it was part of the paternalistic system.
Yes,
Say, we
maybe.
know we know what's right for people,
Yeah.
and it's
Mm.
been a transformation actually in research, where a lot of research, a lot of innovation now starts with the women or with the practitioners. So an
Hmm.
example of that, this system has become quite complex. It's called a LifeStart system, but of course you can't really afford that in many parts of the world. So we've developed now. I've got it just here actually. I'll show you. We've
Please.
developed a thing called the Baby Saver, which is it's just a simple platform. It's very easy. All it is the platform that you would
Looks
put
like a
it.
baby tub.
It's very well. It's got this sort of tub underneath because it means that you can have it closed like that. You can have equipment inside it, and it's just kept to one side because on the whole you don't need it. But at the time, if any problem does occur, you can just put your hand out and suddenly you've got it there.
Hmm.
You've got a platform that you can put the baby on. That's where the head occurs. That's where the neck occurs. You've got simple instructions because often you don't actually, people resuscitating won't have had very much training
Yeah.
in low income settings. There isn't the
Yeah.
same system that we've got here. But also the equipment is immediately in the tray. So this allows you then to resuscitate a baby with an intact cord, which of course then this is all in here. These follow international guidelines. And so this is a sort of a low cost version of the lifestyle, which called the baby saving tray. So
Amazing.
that's just in the process of being rolled out.
Is it available anywhere now?
Not as yet. We're just signing contracts. I'm waiting any day to hear whether the contracts have been signed.
Excellent.
Because what we were surprised at, I'd built it specifically thinking about the people I brought up. Well, subconsciously, probably the people I was brought up with in Kenya, all those or
Mm.
whatever, 50 years ago. But actually, more where I'd been working in Uganda, it was trying to get a system which we could use easily there.
Hmm.
But actually, when we spoke to paramedics, when we spoke to women to midwives going out for home births in this country, they said, want that. That's exactly what we need in the UK. So
Yeah.
in fact, we've been looking at using it in midwifery, in women having home births, at paramedics. Paramedics desperately want something like this because if they're ever called out to a baby who isn't breathing well at home, suddenly they're, oh my goodness, and they've got nowhere to put it. And people
Yeah.
talk of even using a tray or a chopping board or something, some kind of a flat surface to
Mm.
put the baby on. And actually, how much easier is it to have a surface like this
Yeah.
where the baby is sort of protected within it, where it's actually got simple instructions about, and you can transport the baby even on it. So
Yeah.
it was a
Yeah.
bit of a surprise to us, but it sounds as if actually it's going to be very helpful in this country as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I had a home birth myself with my first baby,
Okay.
but also being a community midwife, we used a corner of the room to set up a mini baby area, and it's
Just
not
in
quite the
case you
same
need it,
as
you hope you don't need it.
yes. Yeah.
But actually, you would have had to have cut the cord, I think, wouldn't you? If the baby
They
wasn't
would
well,
have. Yeah.
what would you have
Yeah.
done? You would have cut the cord
Yes.
early, wouldn't you? You would have gone.
Yeah.
So I imagine at your
100%.
home birth, you would have cut the other side of the room
Yeah.
early on with a baby who was very flat.
Yeah.
Flat, that's not quite the right word, is it? But if it wasn't breathing and it was floppy when it was first born, you would have to take it to that area.
Absolutely.
Whereas how much easier would it be if you've got that, which allows you then to deal with the baby right beside. It's shaped actually, so it can just go between a mother's legs.
Yeah.
So that
Perfect.
you've got the space there, the cord is there. You'd of course have a blanket over there, so you're not going to use this sort of hard surface, but you just have a towel on top of it, and then you can do everything there with the mother, and
Yeah.
the mothers really appreciate that as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, that's fantastic. It's very exciting, and like you say, not only in poorer countries, but actually here in the UK as well. I think it's just such an important tool to have, let's say. So I suppose then, going back to a couple of other things I wanted to ask, is it true that delayed because I'm hearing these questions.
Hmm.
Delayed cord clamping can lead to an increase in jaundice in the newborn.
So when you, if a normal curve. I don't know if people know what a normal curve is. You've got that sort of bell-shaped curve, which people
Yeah,
talk about in statistics. If you take a healthy, a newborn
and
baby,
yes, a
there's a
term otherwise healthy.
normal curve of what a hemoglobin would be, what the amount of hemoglobin in the blood would be. There's some with very low, some with very high. And what happens if you delay cord clamping, of course, because you've got more blood coming across, that whole normal curve just shifts and it
Hmm.
just shifts across a little bit so that you get on the whole a higher level of hemoglobin by about 20 grams per liter, which is quite an amount. Um, but of course, at the higher end, that does mean there's increased jaundice because as that extra hemoglobin breaks down and forms iron, there will typically be higher jaundice. Does it cause harm? No. And if you look at the harmful jaundice, which you need to go under, have you seen those lamps? You know the
Yes.
treatment lamps that babies sometimes go under in order to reduce the jaundice. If you look at the levels of those, very slightly increased. If you look at the ones who have it really serious, where you do a thing called an exchange transfusion, where you start taking blood away from the baby, it's no difference.
Hmm.
So, yes, slightly higher rates of jaundice, but
Not the
that's a
harmful
cost of
type.
having hemoglobin. If you look at the other end, remember this is a normal
Yeah.
curve. So you're talking jaundice right at this far end. If you're looking at the other end, which is where they're anemic, is the same levels of anemia? No, anemia is far less common in newborns who've had delayed cord clamping,
Excellent.
and of course that's then what affects the brain, and that's the neurological development and such like. So.
Yeah.
Uh, would you swap a little bit of extra jaundice for better brain development and higher levels of hemoglobin and less iron deficiency? I would every time.
Yeah. No, that's clear. So then how long should this last for? And does the injection for the placenta, the centrometron, does it impact in that exchange?
Yeah, not much really. The oxytocin, the drug that's given, comes across the placenta really very slowly over half an hour to an hour, something like that. So by that just couple of minutes of delayed cord clamping, it doesn't go through into the baby.
Great.
When they've done studies, actually, if you look at the oxytocin occurs in the baby, it's all actually come from the baby itself rather than
Yeah.
either from the mother or from the injection. So
Yeah.
yeah, it doesn't affect the baby. It does the time at which the oxytocin when you give the oxytocin, it takes a few minutes to work, and usually by that time, actually, you've cut and clamped the cord anyway. The
So how
ideal would
long should it be? Yeah. Sorry.
so the guidelines interestingly say at least 1 minute.
Hmm. Is
Now,
that enough?
probably not. I would want to leave it at least three.
Hmm.
Now, all those studies on neurological development, they left it for three.
Hmm.
The biggest studies, and there's a difference sort of between evidence and what's theoretical, and the guidelines focus on at least 1 minute,
Hmm.
because when you put all the different studies together, a lot of studies have used this 1 minute cutoff. And in truth, the majority of the blood that's going to come across will come across in the first minute, something like 80% of it, and then it gets less and less with time.
I
So
suppose when you explain it
really,
around the baby's breathing, baby will start breathing and pull that blood into the lungs in the first few
exactly.
seconds.
And there's
Yeah.
different ways of doing it. So you could say, well, it's strictly, we're going to do it by minutes.
Yeah.
Leave it for 3 minutes. That's what you need to do. Or leave it by 1 minute. The, the reality is that babies, of course, differ hugely. And there's a whole different system of doing it, which is physiologically based cord clamping, where they say, well, only clamp the cord once the baby's properly breathing,
Hmm.
because it needs to fully fill its lungs. And that's the point at which you mustn't clamp it beforehand, which is also very reasonable. The other way of doing it, which is in practical terms the way I like it, is to wait for white. Wait until the cord is white. You can see the blood sitting in the cord, and once the baby's taken what it wants, that's the end. When I do my cesarean section list on a Tuesday, we wait for 2 minutes. It's been our standard.
That was my next question, actually.
So our standard in Liverpool Women's, which we set up, what, 2012. So what, really, is that 14 years ago? Yes, it is. But 2 minutes was our standard for cesarean sections, for normal births, any kind of birth. And that's all worked it's very simple now. Once you're used to it, it's very easy. But what we do is that on the whole, I'm waiting until the cord goes white. And sometimes the placenta starts to come out already.
Yeah.
Actually, that's okay, because I'm not really worried about the placenta still being attached. What I'm wanting is the blood to transfer across the baby. And I'm also looking then for the cord to whiten. And so sometimes you find that at a minute, the cord is completely empty. And you go, well, no point in waiting the next minute, and you cut and clamp it at that point. If you get to
Absolutely.
2 minutes and it's still bulging with blood and still thick with blood, you go, well, there's clearly still a lot here for the baby if it wants it. So we normally wait another minute at that stage. And if everyone's going, come on, Prof Weeks, come on, we're because theatres work to timelines, and I know we shouldn't do, but they're sort of, God, it's Weeks on his
Next
thing
person
again.
is out.
So sometimes I get sort of come on, Andrew, come on, hurry up. So at that stage, then if you clamp the cord, but you clamp it right beside the placenta, so actually any of the blood which is in the cord, and then the baby goes with quite a long bit of cord and the clamp on the end. You say, well, off you go, little one. Take what you want over the next 20 minutes or so. And if after the end of 20 minutes the cord has still got a load of blood in it, well, okay, you maybe didn't need it. But almost all the babies then, just as they're breathing, it slowly gets taken up into their body. So yeah, so that works quite well. I think wait for white is it's a phrase we came up with Amanda Burley back when in 2015 or something like that, to describe this process, because pulsation doesn't help. There's an old system whereby you waited until it stopped
I
pulsating.
see.
But actually, the trouble is with pulsation is that it's the arteries, which is the blood leaving the baby,
Yeah,
and you're more interested in the blood coming back to the baby. So,
makes sense.
and the pulsation really doesn't equate to how much blood is transferring. So pulsation you should forget about. What you really need to do is wait until the cord is emptied and the baby's taken what it wants. So
Yeah.
wait for white, I think, is right. We say in the guidelines, we've just written the guidelines. People will be able to see it, the RCOG SIP guidelines on cord clamping. And we say move to baby watching, watch the baby. And if the baby's breathing well and the cord is whitened, that's your time to cut and clamp the cord. But leave it at least a minute. You should never do it under a minute.
Hmm. That's really reassuring in that sense. Would you say it's happening across the UK?
Yeah, yeah. It was, I mean, it was surprisingly interesting and easy to implement, because her once women started to hear about this, actually it was then women who are driving it in many units,
Yeah.
and many women in Liverpool who don't know that we've been part of this. Before the cesarean section, they'll come when I meet them before the cesarean section, and they say, "Oh, I say, have you got any particular requests? Is there music you want played, or what?"
Yeah.
And they say, "Oh, what can I get delayed cord clamping? Would that be okay?" And you go, well, let me tell you a story. Well, I don't normally tell them all the stuff that we've done, but they say, yeah, absolutely, you will get uh, um, cord clamping at least 2 minutes. We've been doing that for many years. So
That's
I think women have driven the change in a lot of places. And actually, it's been even those units which are quite resistant to change, they're stuck in their ways and they're very
mm,
traditional. Once the women start asking for it, you go, why? And then you say, well, why are they asking for this delayed cord clamping? Then you start looking at the guidelines and you see, well, actually, the guidelines are all saying we
makes
should
sense.
do it. And then you look legally and think, well, actually, if my baby did run into problems and needed a blood transfusion when it's a neonate, and we know that delayed cord clamping prevents the need for blood transfusions. My baby had a blood transfusion and got a reaction to it, and they didn't implement delayed cord clamping. That was probably one of the causes for it, and
Mm,
it won't be long before the first court cases come up,
mm,
and people are sued for not doing
yeah,
uh, delayed cord clamping because it's an important part of practice, and it actually for premature babies reduces the rate of death in premature babies. So
yeah,
it's a really important. What we thought was a nice to have actually is actually not a nice to have. It's
vital.
absolutely critical to have.
Yeah,
Uh, and it's almost on the first on the list in the neonatal unit of things we have to implement.
yeah, absolutely. So, one last question, maybe. But if there was one thing across UK maternity services and care that we provide that you could change, that you feel would have the most impact, what do you think that would be?
I think in the current climate, I think it would be to reinstitute trust between us as carers and women in our and families in our care. And I know there's a lot of reasons why that's broken down. And you only need to look at the birth trauma stories or look at the stories of people who have had bad outcomes, and you can understand why trust has broken down. Um, but equally, I think things have moved on quite a lot from then. And you can see that in now what have we got? 46% Caesarean section rate was the last figures that come out. The clearly isn't this drive anymore to you must have a vaginal birth even if you don't want it, and even if you're struggling and you're asking for a Caesarean section, no, you're not going to have it because we are ideologically driven to ignore all danger signs and push you. Of course, that can't be there when we've got the
No,
highest Caesarean section rate in the world. It isn't there. It left about, well, probably before COVID. It's been slowly coming on over the years, but there are a variety of legal cases which led to changes, and there was the empowerment of women, which has rightly come. But what's happened actually, as all these stories have come out, is that women have become very distrusting of the maternity
yeah,
services, and I sort of get that. But equally, I think things have changed within the NHS. I think we always provided high quality care, but what sometimes we didn't get right is the communication. What we didn't get right is sometimes even when we didn't provide high quality care,
mm,
which when you think, I mean, there's 600,000 births a year, so there's a
yeah,
lot of births, and you can always find examples of people who had bad outcomes or where they
of
weren't given good
course.
care. But then the whole legal system is confrontational, and that led to trusts going, oh no, I'm sure we did it all right, I'm sure we didn't,
Mm,
and so trusts became quite scared because we were paying out so much in litigation fees. You then become quite scared and careful you
mm,
don't admit anything, don't put anything which could put us in legal danger. And so that built up a sort of a confrontation
mm,
but between families and between hospitals and institutions. Um, Now, thankfully, that's all changed over the last 8 to 10 years.
mm,
And so a lot of it has been between from has come from the brave families who've spoken out and who have, wow, it's tough for them to have gone through.
mm,
And it's been painful process, I think, for us within the institutions as well. But I think things have changed a lot, and what we're seeing now actually is not the changes, but the effects of people now very distrusting and uh, very anxious about coming into hospitals to give birth. And the sad thing is that often that's going to make things worse. And if people are having a cesarean section when there's no indication whatsoever, and they go on to have future births, sadly, there's going to be bad outcomes sometimes in those future births, which
Yeah.
didn't need to happen.
Yeah.
And there's I think that people's anxiety now is causing an awful lot of problems. And it's causing some women to do that, but other women not to come to hospital at all,
Yeah.
or women to decide to free birth at home because they don't so trust the services. And I think that's now causing harm. And it's sort of sad for the women and the families involved because they're doing it of the best intentions. They
Of
want to
course.
protect themselves. They want to protect their baby. And when you hear all the media reports around it, it's no surprise that you get scared. Um, but I think the thing that I would change then would be to rebuild trust. And that's going to take some time. It's going to take both of us working together. I think it's going to take good antenatal education so that we get the consent process right.
Yeah.
Um, but I think it's also going to take time for all these reviews, all multiple. You've heard about how many different recommendations there are from maternity. Once all those reviews start, and there's a lot of sort of catharsis to come out. There's a lot of people who want to tell their stories.
Of
There's people
course.
who've been harmed within maternity systems who want to tell their stories and so sort of want their day in court, which is understandable.
I
The
think it's
difficulty
human
is,
nature in many ways. We want to warn the other ones so that they don't have to go through the same experience. I suppose if you look evolutionary from an evolutionary point of view,
yeah,
that
I think
is
that's
what
true.
protected us, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I guess it's just
It's not wrong, but
no.
it does put a huge amount of fear
Yes.
in the hearts of women.
And
Uh,
obviously we have social media, which, it's
Social media
accessible by
doesn't
everyone.
help, but
Yeah.
also the effect on the staff. I know people don't see this and they think, well, why should we care about the bloody staff when we've been harmed? Yes, that's
Yeah.
true, but actually it's the staff who are going to be looking after you when you come in.
Yeah.
And the to get the culture change that we need within the hospitals, actually we need to keep the staff on side.
Yeah.
The staff are not bad people. They're trying to change. They're trying to get things into place. They're trying to get things right. But this is quite a big culture change, whereby they're no longer in charge. They used to be in charge, and so say, right, I'm the doctor, or I'm the midwife. You need to do this, this, and this. And
Mm,
it's a big culture change to
it
to
is.
to saying this is what we would advise. What do you want to do? And that's different, and we need to take the staff with us. But it's a very demoralising time for the NHS maternity staff. A lot are leaving, a lot are disillusioned, and actually, what you don't want is somebody looking after you in hospital who's disillusioned, upset, feel they're on the back foot all the time. Everybody's getting at them. There's another media story today which tells of somebody else's trauma. That's not helping staff to provide the best care.
No.
So I'm hoping that this storm will come and go, and we'll be left with it with a much better system where there really are women are empowered to make the decision, and we completely support them whether they want hospital births, even if it seems unreasonable. It's their choice. If they want to have a cesarean
Of course.
section, or if they want to have a home birth, then they're equally protected, whatever route they want to. And different women want different things.
Yeah.
And as maternity system, we need to be there to support them. And what we don't want to do is just support people having cesareans, because that's in danger of happening as midwifery services are being run down and midwives are becoming demoralized. actually we're finding that increasingly we're going to lose that ability if we're not careful to provide good maternity, to
Mm.
provide good care for normal
Normal
births or for
births,
home
yeah.
births. And so you're caring for those who want a very medicalized birth, and you're denying care for those who want a less medicalized birth,
So true.
and that's not fair either.
Yeah.
You may have said the pendulum was too far over looking after those. If you go back to the 70s or 80s, there's some who'd argue, well, we were completely supportive of those who wanted natural births, and they won out over those over getting good medical care.
Mm.
Um, the worry is that the pendulum's swinging too far, where actually, if you want a cesarean section, easy, no problem. You just say, you click your fingers and you get a cesarean section.
Yeah.
If you want a home birth, oh God, we closed those down because we couldn't do home births because um, uh, we needed so many extra staff on to do cesarean sections and to do postnatal care, surgical care that, and you'll see there's home birth services being closed down around the
Yeah.
country.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so we
Such an
need to care
important
for
point,
both sides.
actually. Yeah.
We need to be careful that we don't, um, if we are making cultural change, and I think that's right that we do it, that women should be in charge, but actually it needs to happen both ways. It's
Yeah.
not just that they can say, I want a cesarean section. They need to say, I want a home birth. And that's fine. And we need to support them through it. And we need to make sure that our services are well set up, because
And fit
actually
for
that
purpose.
often
Yeah.
gives the safest and the best care to have a home birth for many women.
Yeah. It feels like a brave thing to do almost nowadays.
Well, it does. Whereas it's the most, I mean, I speak as somebody who's born at home myself. You know, it's the most natural thing to do. And what you need to do, though, is to have good escalation if things do go wrong, because labours do sometimes go wrong. But
Absolutely.
in truth, if you've got a woman who doesn't have any risk factors and is completely well, and you've got well trained midwives and doctors who are available and rapid transport for when they need it, actually the
Hmm.
outcomes are very good.
Yeah.
Uh,
No, absolutely. Yeah. Such a good point. And is there anything that maybe we should have touched on that people should know about, but we maybe didn't get a chance to discuss, or maybe not in enough detail? I know we could probably continue for days, but anything comes to
I
mind?
think that's covered a lot of the things that yeah, we needed to cover. I think the yeah, we've covered the international, the reduction in maternal deaths internationally, trust in maternity services, increases in cesarean sections. Uh, no, I think that's covered the things that I had in my mind. It's covered.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Andrew. As I mentioned, I could talk to you for another 5 hours. This has been really interesting to me, and I hope whoever is listening to this has found it really interesting. But before we close, I was wondering, where can we follow your work?
So I use LinkedIn mainly for social media stuff. So you can follow me, Andrew Weeks,
Andrew Weeks.
on LinkedIn. I used to do a lot on Twitter, but I found it increasingly a very divisive and hostile environment. So and I haven't. My daughter keeps saying, "Dad, you need to go on Instagram and TikTok," and I'm afraid I haven't. Maybe that's an age thing, but or else follow through the University of Liverpool. So we've in fact got a podcast coming out about innovations because increasingly we're working around innovations. So we've got 8 different innovations that we're developing within the university here. We've got £4 million of funding from various sources to develop it. So where a lot of my work now has actually moved on a bit from global health and is now
Hmm.
focused on innovations, which will be important here, but also important internationally.
Yeah.
Yeah, so follow through the University of Liverpool.
Yeah, very exciting. And actually, the northern part of England as well seems to be taking off in terms of innovation. So I guess it's an exciting time, isn't it?
So we set up this thing called the Women's Innovation Studio, WIN Studio, WIN. which I appreciate with Liverpool at the moment. People say, "Wind? Liverpool? That's unusual." Yeah, the Wind Studio in Liverpool, that's the focus of our innovations, and that's where we're going to be doing.
Excellent. Thank you so, so much again. This was an absolute pleasure speaking with you, and thank you so
Yeah,
much
it's been a
for
delight.
taking the time.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and good luck with the ongoing work. It's a great podcast that you run,
Thank you.
and I shall look forward to hearing from further guests.
Thank you.
Okay.